Welcome to the UK. Everybody here talks about inequality, fairness and privilege. Now, what is the biggest privilege? The biggest privilege in my opinion is having a paid off mortgage. See all these old grandmas walking around Asda's limping around and you feel bad for them. These Donnies bought their houses for £2.50 in 1970 and they voted for Brexit, so don't feel too bad. These are the people who keep destroying our country with policies that hamstring anybody under the age of 45. In fact, I'm pretty sure people in their 50s are getting screwed as well. The average UK renter pays £1,000 a month. This is the average. So the numbers are probably more around £900, £800 a month for the regular people. We're not all high-end Dubai citizens renting out mansions for 10 grand a month. But the average UK renter is paying about £1,000 a month just in rent. That doesn't include bills or utilities or anything else. What we have in this situation is cities being crammed full of people that will never ever come out of the perpetual cycle of renting. These are usually young people with dreams and ambitions and productive people who contribute to society through hard work and labour. Unfortunately, what they've been left becoming now is what I like to call a Rentcel. And just because you don't live in your mum's basement doesn't mean you're not a Rentcel. If you cannot simply afford to move out, you too, my friend, are a Rentcel. And the population of Rentcels is becoming a big problem for MPs and politicians because they want to win your vote, and there's only one way they can do this, by offering you bonuses and benefits. But the way they do it is quite sneaky and evil because they actually don't help you that much at all. So what are the cons to renting? Why does everybody really dislike the process of renting? So the first problem I'd say is you're at the mercy of the landlord. That could be things such as no pets. They could have a problem with you. They could want to do visits or viewings. And although you have protections legally, eventually you do have to give in and let them do that. There could also be potential delays in getting things repaired. So if things go wrong, and as they do in UK property, things do go wrong and they're expensive to repair, the landlord might try and use some mental gymnastics to delay fixing them. If it's your own property, you'll probably get it done if you know it's important because you're living there and you're reaping the negative effects. Now, the second kind of big issue is just general control and stability. You have to deal with a letting agent usually to extend tenancy agreements. Things aren't that easy in terms of the paperwork. You're always looking for the fact that there's probably rent increases due. So you might go from paying £600 a month to £680 a month for, I've heard from rent increases that go from £1,000 a month to £1,500 a month. It does happen in very terrible markets, but those are just some of the other issues. And finally, in my opinion, the biggest problem is renting in general is usually more expensive than buying a property in terms of how much you pay monthly. Obviously, with the current interest rates, that might have changed for more higher end properties or like towards the higher end of average. However, in general, renting is more expensive. On top of that, you gain no equity and you gain no actual monetary value with all that money you pay. So if you're paying a mortgage of £1,000 a month, about £200 of that, if the interest rates are quite high, is going towards equity, which is effectively you saving money as long as your house price increases, which they nearly always do. And again, on top of that, you're still liable for other things such as rent, utilities and council tax, and other issues such as if you live in a flat, which a lot of people do rent flats, you can't really have control over things such as parking, etc. It can be a pain to deal with all of these various people when it comes to those sort of facilities that are on offer in the properties you're renting. So yeah, renting as a whole has a lot of negatives. Obviously so does buying, but this video is primarily on renting, so I'm focusing on that. We now have Rishi Sunak coming up with the Rentcel Reform Bill, which is an interesting way of solving the housing crisis. Basically, he said you can have pets and you can't be evicted without fault. The truth is that the Rentcel Reform Bill is doing very little to actually solve the problems that people have when it comes to housing. The fact that it's super expensive and renting is nearly always a losing game. Now, when it comes to pets, if your biggest concern in life is having a pet in your rented property, then he's won you over with this. But the truth is, for most people, they're trying to survive, and pets, I'm guessing, not a huge percentage of the population have pets. You know, it's probably definitely in the minority, so I wouldn't really consider that as a massive win. You know, a lot of landlords in the past did allow pets, and there are still some grounds on which pets are not allowed. So I'm sure if a landlord really wanted to, they could stop that. It's just a cheap way to win a bit of media attention. There is a new property ombudsman, which is a good idea in theory, but the problem is, how will it be staffed? How will it work? Will it actually solve the problems? Will it be a bit like the energy ombudsman, where as soon as you put a complaint in, you got to wait 6 to 8 months for any response? So it's one of those ones where in theory it sounds great, but the proof will be in the pudding. Everything will become an assured tenancy, which means that it's going to be a rolling contract as soon as possible. So as soon as you start, the rolling contract will start. There'll be no fixed terms. I think in theory that's positive, but rent increases can come at any point, I think. So it's one of those ones where in theory it sounds great, but there might be issues around it, especially when it comes to landlords being very wary of who they let into their properties. It might make it harder to get a rented property in the first place. There's also the fact that Section 21 has gone, which is another reason why it's going to be harder to actually get a rented place in the first place. There might be more stringent checks. There might be less allowance of things such as, self-employment as evidence of income, and there might be more of an onus on references, etc., to ensure that you're a good tenant, because a bad tenant can actually ruin a landlord's life. And then finally, which I think is very cheeky, the whole no-fault eviction idea is a bit of a nonsense, because you can still find loopholes to get rid of tenants, such as pretend you're selling the property, get rid of the tenant, and as soon as you start to sell the property, you can change your mind after a couple of weeks. So yeah, there are still ways to repossess the property. It doesn't solve the major issue, which is the fact that rents have so far increased massively when it comes to wages. People are not paid enough. Rents are super high. Nobody can save to buy a property. Property prices keep going up. There's just not enough property in the first place, which is great if you own a property in theory, but terrible if you don't. And I think ultimately my kind of morality when it comes to this is you got to fix the problem yourself. Unfortunately, the government is not going to help you, and you shouldn't expect them to, because the reality is these people have their own vested interests. The housing crisis didn't happen overnight, and it will not be solved by one simple reform. It is something that requires massive intervention from the government to actually solve, and unfortunately I personally do not believe that anybody in the government actually cares much about solving it, because a lot of people in that position, first of all, are old and out of touch. They've lived through systems that do not exist, such as council housing. Council housing for most people just doesn't exist. Unless you're like severely disabled and have a super high priority, you're not really going to be given subsidized rental council housing. It's just not going to happen. Most of the council houses have been sold or are already occupied. New ones are rarely built, and when they are built, they're not of the best quality. So essentially, you're in a bad position right now. Further to this, a lot of people in government are also landlords, which means they have a vested interest in keeping property prices high and rent yields also quite high. So there's a double whammy effect here. These people don't want change, and on top of that, they're unwilling to give any concessions over. Things such as the Renters Reform Bill look good on paper, and they do provide some value. However, they do not solve anything, and long term the problem will still persist. All it takes is a good understanding of how these laws work, and you can subvert them for your own benefits. Unfortunately, a lot of people who want to benefit from these sort of schemes will not have the wherewithal to understand exactly how lacking these policies are, and that's the issue. No one's going to save you from your own ignorance, and unfortunately the world is going into a very hyper competitive, very dog-eat-dog direction. The welfare state as we know it has been collapsing since the 70s, and that collapse has gone into overdrive ever since the late 2000s with the financial crisis and all of that. So we're in a position where if you're not looking out for number one and living frugally and saving and trying your utmost to get onto the property ladder in a meaningful way, then no one's going to do it for you. So you need to think hard and realize that it's up to you to get onto that property ladder. And unfortunately, even for those people with the wherewithal and the technical skill and ability to get onto the property ladder, the time in my opinion is ticking. Eventually, even starter homes will be relatively unaffordable for most people, and the only way to own a home would be through inheritance or through some massive stroke of luck or just amazing business skills, because the average salary, even the above average salary, will just not be able to allow you to buy a house inside any of the major cities in the United Kingdom. So that's where I see things going. So my message to you guys is to heed my warning. Being a Rentcel is what they want you to be. Being someone unaware of how finances work is what they want you to be. Being someone incapable of leaving this torturous cycle of spending every waking hour simply trying to survive is what they want you to be. Living in moldy, cramped, damp accommodation is what they want you to be. So you need to consider that and work every single day to make sure you're not one of those who are left behind by our cruel capitalist cog turning machine. And that's all I have to say. Just look out for yourself. No one's gonna save you. You gotta save yourself. Unless you're like some Instagram baddie, then maybe some Saudi sheikh will come. But not you, fam. You're clapped.